Today we are sitting in David Mao's office at the Law Library of Congress exploring his life and career in law librarianship. David was appointed as the 23rd Law Librarian of Congress in January 2012. David, it is our custom to begin these conversations by asking for a little personal history. I know that you were born in New York City but raised in Lawrenceville, New Jersey. Could you please tell us about your family and your pre-college years?
Sure. I essentially grew up in Lawrenceville, New Jersey. We moved from New York to New Jersey soon after I was born. I have one sister. My parents worked in the area. My father worked for, well, what was then Mobil, now Exxon Mobil, and they have a large research facility in the Princeton area. And so I essentially, like I said, grew up in the area, went to schools there, and didn't leave until I came to Washington, D.C. to go to college.
You also spent some time living in China. Was this with your family, alone, or with some specialized program?
Combination of that. I did my junior year abroad, as many students do when they're in college. One of the reasons why I chose to come to school in Washington, D.C. was because I was interested in the international aspect of, well, Washington and politics and things like that. So during my junior year, I took the opportunity to spend some time in China. I actually went through a program through Duke University. It was called the Duke Study in China program, and I spent 2 months, the first 2 months, the summer of '88, I think it was, in Beijing. And then the fall semester, we had the program at Nanjing University. And then in the spring, the program ended after 6 months, and then I decided I wanted to extend the stay. So I did an independent study. I made arrangements for through a school in southwest China. I wanted to move away from the east coast of China into the, I guess back then it would have been the hinterlands of China. Southwest China, a small city outside of Chongqing, and I spent the spring semester there. Was planning to stay through the following summer of 1989 as well, but if you may remember from history, that was the June 4th incident, and so actually we didn't know what was going on. I was out traveling through southwest China at the time, and because there was a lot of unrest, nobody really knew what it was that was happening. I just got on a flight, flew to Hong Kong, and I arrived back in the States on June 1st, so a couple days before the June 4th massacre, the Tiananmen massacre.
Now, were you fluent before you went to China?
No, I studied Chinese while I was at GW. That's where I did my undergraduate work. International affairs was my major, but I had a minor in Chinese language and literature. Certainly growing up, my parents, who are immigrants, spoke Chinese at home, but I never went to Chinese school, so like many people, perhaps even like you yourself, I can understand what is being said. If I went to a restaurant, I suppose I could order myself a nice meal. But it really wasn't until I got to GW that I really started to study the language. And then, of course, having spent a year in China, really developed pretty good fluency. I would say that when I came back, near fluency, I could pretty much read a newspaper, not necessarily understand every single character on the page, but know enough of it that I could understand what the article was talking about. Now, of course, 25, 30 years later, can't quite say the same, but it was certainly a very good experience.
That's great. Was there anything about your visit there that surprised you that you weren't expecting?
Yes, and this is something where when I'm talking to students who are considering going abroad, I think it's really important in this day and age. Harder to do in this day and age, but I think it's very, very important for especially Americans to go to, if not a third world or a second world country, if you will, because it's just very, very different. Growing up here in the United States, you have a lot of things that you take for granted, and so back then when we were in China, for example, even in big cities, once a week they would turn the power off, or the hot water would only run during certain times of the day. Little things like that that you really don't think about, but have an effect on how you schedule your day. You know, for example, if they turn the electricity off, okay, well then you have to go to class during the light hours, and when it's dark, you learn to do other things like that. And I think maybe less so for me because I had heard the stories, you know, from my parents, certainly as immigrants, and them growing up during the war and all those kinds of things where they had to experience the things like that. But quite a few of my classmates that were in the program, the Duke program, I think were a bit shocked by some of the things that they encountered when they got there. I mean, even if they knew about it beforehand, it's not until you actually go there and experience it that you understand those things. And so that's why I think it's very important for kids nowadays to see that, experience that, and really understand how lucky they are to be in the United States and have all that we do have.
So aside from appreciation from what we have and
Sure.
recognition that not everyone has the same advantages, were there any other lasting lessons that you got from your time abroad?
Yes, I think it's very, very important to understand different cultures. It's not just the differences in have and have-nots, but it's actually the culture itself, and that's part of what I was saying in terms of going to a different country. You know, certainly it's very nice to travel to, say, Europe, and I'm not in any way trying to disrespect Europe, but because the culture is very, very similar to what we have here in the United States, I think, you know, for example, if you were in an African country or a Muslim country or Latin America, where maybe there are, in addition to Western influences, there may be more indigenous influences, things like that. I think it's important for folks to learn that as well. And then here, it helps them deal with very many situations. And in particular here at the Law Library, I mean, we're a perfect example. We have foreign law specialists from all over the world. Some people like to joke we're a little model UN because we have people from all over the world here, and you have to understand and respect all of that.
Great. Now, when did you decide to go to law school?
Let's see. I decided to go to law school. I think I actually thought about going to law school when I was in high school. I have a cousin who, the two of us are the black sheep in the family. All of our, you know, both my grandparents, both of my parents, uncles, aunts, my sister, everybody, they're all engineers. As, you know, most Asians do, they go to engineering school. And my cousin and I were the black sheep. He went to law school first. He was law school in the 80s when I was still in high school, and talking about it and how wonderful it was, or maybe not how wonderful it was, but how a great experience it was in terms of an intellectual experience. And so I decided to follow suit when I was a third year at GW. In fact, I remember thinking about it while I was studying in China. I was trying to think about, well, you know, I'm going to go back next year. I have to sit for the LSAT. What can I do to prepare? And unfortunately in China there's not much you can do to prepare for the LSAT, but I did think about it then, and that's, you know, I did follow suit. I went straight from undergraduate to law school.
And why Georgetown?
Again, because it was here in DC. I loved coming to DC for college. Fabulous experience being in the city, being among, as I mentioned, multicultural, everything, and Georgetown just seemed to be the natural fit. I was also accepted at GW, but I thought, well, maybe a change of venues might be helpful, and it was a great experience.
So now, was your cousin's description of law school adequate to prepare you?
You know, actually, it was when I applied to law school and actually decided to go. I think the first question he had asked me at that point in time was, "Are you sure you want to do this?" He had gone to the University of Chicago and was working at, I believe at that time he was working at Sherman and Sterling in New York, and so really was in the thick of things, and I think he was trying to dissuade me not to go to law school, but of course I didn't listen, and I went ahead and did it. So.
Did you have a particular interest when you started law school? Practice area?
No, actually I did not. I was open to anything. Certainly there were classes that I took. Copyright I thought was very interesting. I took Professor Feinerman's Chinese law seminar, and he's fabulous. And you know, certainly that tied into my undergraduate interest in international affairs, things like that. But I didn't really have any particular area that I was interested in, hence why I think I just ended up doing general litigation when I came out, because I didn't know what I wanted to do.
Perfect segue. So
Okay.
your first job upon graduation
Yes.
was with a large firm on commercial litigation matters.
That's right.
What was the firm, and could you describe for us your experience there?
Sure. So I'll step back by just answering to give you a little bit of a segue for later.
Mm-hmm.
When I was a third year and looking to graduate, I had actually worked in the law library during law school as a work-study student, and I loved it. So at that point in time, I actually talked to a couple of the librarians about a possible career in law library. So put that aside. But I did end up practicing for a couple of years. Worked for a firm in New Jersey. The firm is Hannick Weisman, which no longer exists. They imploded, probably as many firms did. I would say maybe around 2000 or thereabouts. But when I was working for them, they were at that point in time, I think, the second largest firm in the state of New Jersey. doing just about everything. And I was assigned to work in the litigation department, commercial litigation. There were two big projects that I worked on. One was products liability defense, because products liability law is very well developed in New Jersey, and there are a lot of pharmaceutical industry in New Jersey. And the firm represented a pharmaceutical company, and so we were assigned to do defense. And so I worked with one partner in particular. She was on the national trial team dealing with these issues, and so I was her associate, if you will. She'd be traveling around working on these national trial issues, and I would get the call, stay up late and do a memo. Yeah, exactly. That was one piece of what I did, and the other part was couple of other assignments. Construction, there was a big, huge construction litigation I was involved in, and I think that's pretty much it. In the 3 years there, didn't get a lot of court experience, just basically mostly writing memos and briefs and things like that. Did go to court a few times, actually only had one trial, so it is what they say. Usually you get more trial experience if you work in a smaller shop, in a solo place, but that was the extent of my experience.
And when you went there, had you deliberately targeted New Jersey to go back towards your family, or that just happened to be serendipity?
A combination of both. I was looking here in DC and in New Jersey, and I summered the first summer I did a summer associate position here in DC, and then the second year I did it in New Jersey. And when they offered me the job, I actually took it for a variety of reasons. One, I could live at home. I know, I get that answer, that look all the time, but quite frankly, Georgetown wasn't cheap. And I had a few loans to pay off, and so my parents were very kind to me. They didn't charge me rent. I could stay at home and making a good salary, make a hefty investment in my student loans, and I was able to pay them off in about 3 years.
Smart move.
That's what I tell students nowadays. I mean, certainly you have to understand living at home can have its issues, but my parents were pretty good. Sometimes I could just leave $20 on the table in the morning, leave a note, Mom, can you run to the cleaners to pick up my shirts? Fine. They would cook dinner, my mom would cook dinner and just leave it, even if I got home at 10 o'clock, dinner was on the table. My only rule was I had to do my own dishes and get it over with, which is fine. But they didn't really harass me. They left me, as I said, you have to deal with, every once in a while my mother would drop comments. Well, I have a friend whose daughter's in New York, maybe over the weekend you might want to, give her a call or something things like that. But other than that, they were pretty cool.
And you would have to deal with that everywhere. It doesn't matter where you live, right?
Okay. So I dealt with that, and then after 3 years, the opportunity came up to come down to Georgetown.
So after several years, you did make a career change to law librarianship.
It is. I did.
Why then, and why librarianship?
And so that's the serendipity there. And a lot of my career, I like to characterize as serendipity, and because it just happened to be in the right place at the right time. So, as I'd mentioned before, when I was in law school, I worked in the library. I really had a fabulous experience, and indeed did talk to two librarians at the time who I would characterize as early mentors, who were talking to me about the career in librarianship. One is the Dean Postar, and the other is Darcy Kirk. They were both at Georgetown at the time. And I think Darcy, it might have been Darcy or it might have been a dean, I don't remember which one, broke it to me when they said, well, there's this thing called library school that you need to do before you can do this. And as I've mentioned, Georgetown is not inexpensive, and so the thought of having to go back to school and potentially spending more money wasn't at the top of the list, and so I did take the job. And so what happened was, I think it was maybe around March or April of, I can't remember what year, but I actually came down to DC to get sworn into the DC bar because of reciprocity. I had New Jersey and Pennsylvania bars, and that you could waive into DC, and so I filled out the forms and I did it, and I came down. And after getting sworn in, I walked over from the courthouse over to Georgetown just to visit, since I was in DC. And at that point in time, I had a conversation with Celeste Feather, who was at Georgetown at the time as the Access Services Librarian. And again, she asked me, so, you were always interested in librarianship. Are you still interested? What would you be interested in doing, et cetera? And then one thing led to another. She mentioned that there was a position, not a professional position, a technical or a technician position opening up at Georgetown, working for a dean. She suggested that perhaps I should apply and then consider going to library school. And so I thought, okay, why not? So I contacted a dean, filled out the application, and I don't know why. I interviewed with the dean in Darcy, I remember, and they hired me. So I worked for a dean, which was a terrific experience. Georgetown was fabulous. Bob Oakley was the director at the time, terrific in terms of being mentors. I remember a couple of things that they did in particular, which I thought really helped with my career, was because I was in library school, and I suppose because I had a law degree, they let me work at the reference desk and even staff the reference desk when the librarians had their weekly all-staff meeting. You know, it's not a lot of time, but it is experience at the reference desk. They involved me in a lot of things that may not have involved other staff with, for example, working on the first redesign of the Law Library website. So sitting in a room talking about how things should be placed and the content, things like that. You know, if you think back to the 90s, that was the thing. And so I was getting a lot of experience. So I have to thank a dean and, you know, Darcy and a dean and Bob for agreeing to let me get all of this experience. And so then, of course, they hired me. So I'm stepping back here. They hired me. And I thought, okay, now what do I do? I had to quit my job, move to Washington, and apply to library school, which I did in a matter of like 2 months. And that's the beginning of that story. So a little bit of serendipity there.
So that's a huge shift, though, in terms of not just geographic location, but in terms of pay scale, everything.
Yes.
Is a huge, huge adjustment.
I think when I told my parents I was going to do that, I think there was silence, and perhaps they thought they didn't hear right and thought, are you sure you know what you're talking about? But it's all worked out, and I couldn't have, you know, made a better decision. I think it was terrific.
Now, was it challenging going to school and working at the same time?
No, I don't think so. And I'm not trying to make it sound like, you know, library school is nothing. But, you know, library school, after doing law school, library school if you're in that mode and you understand about writing and these kinds of things, it wasn't that difficult. It was just, and also the fact that I had worked. I think maybe that's the more important piece, that having worked, I had some sort of an idea of a schedule. So I would come to work, do my work, go to class, do my work, and understand that there was a schedule that I needed to follow because I had that work experience, you know, especially practicing law, where you know you have a schedule and you have these rules that you have to follow, and you need to get this filing in on time, otherwise something's gonna happen, things like that. So with that mindset, it wasn't that difficult, and certainly Catholic being right up the road, it was very convenient. Jump on the red line, go up 2 stops, go to class. It all worked out very well.
Great.
So.
Now, your first professional job was at Covington Burling.
Yes.
Working under Roberta Schaefer's leadership.
Yes.
What interested you in law firm librarianship in particular? And once you started, was it as you had imagined?
Okay, a good question. Again, I'm going to quote my serendipity here. So when I was at Catholic, I took Roberta's law library management class, I think it was, and she would do her class at Covington and also take us to visit other libraries and speak with other library directors at firms, at agencies, to understand management styles of different law libraries. So that was my first introduction to law firm management. And then while I was at Georgetown, happened to see a posting that came up on the LLSDC with listserv, I think. Were listservs around back then? I think they were. So, Covington was looking for a legislative librarian, and I thought, well, that sounds really interesting. Legislation, which my interest in policy and international affairs, that was why I was in Washington, so clearly a match there. Covington as a firm always had a tradition of a great support for law librarianship, 2 past presidents for AALL, 2 past presidents for LLSDC, or actually 3 for LLSDC, I think. So very, very big support in the firm for the profession, and so I thought, I can't go wrong there. And then, of course, Roberta Schaefer's the director. So I, again, serendipitously just threw in my resume, and they hired me. So it was terrific. Legislative librarianship is a interesting position, probably only found here in the Washington, D.C. area. At the time, it was sort of on the cusp of electronics, so stuff was much more in print. I remember one of my jobs was to read the Congressional Record daily edition from page to page every day, to index it, circulate the material that was of interest to our attorneys, cut out potential material for legislative histories that we're compiling, things like that. And it really gave me a good overview and a good appreciation of the legislative process. And you know, to this day, I can still, if you ask me something, I can probably figure out where it's going to be in the congressional record, because it's pretty similar. You say, oh, you're looking for this, that usually happens this hour. You know, you flip there and that kind of stuff. Of course, now it's a lot easier because most of it's electronically searchable and available. But that was my first job there. And the nice thing about Covington is they gave me the opportunity to experience different things. So in my almost 8 years there, I was legislative librarian. I also managed conflicts for the firm. Conflicts because Covington being a large multinational firm, with international offices, and you have to make sure that you're not suing your client, right? So that was part of my job, is to manage the conflicts, the database, and clear conflicts for the firm. So I did that, and then the last piece of what I also did was help supervisor manage the reference desk at the very end. So I had a lot of interesting jobs there before I came over to the Library of Congress.
Now, was it difficult to, having worked in a firm as an attorney, was it at all challenging to be in a completely different role at a different firm?
I understand what your question is, and I would say at Covington, no. I think there are two answers to that. One is the mindset. You have to understand, because I've talked to a lot of people who are either former paralegals or former attorneys who've tried to make the change into law librarianship and don't understand why there's a hierarchy, if you will. I mean, it's even like in an academic situation. You know, a law professor is not the same necessarily as a law librarian. There is a hierarchy. The dean is at the top.
Absolutely.
Same thing in the law firms. You know, you have your partners, you have your associates, you have your perhaps staff attorneys, you have of counsel, you have paralegals, secretaries, and there is a hierarchy. And if you understand that and can essentially deal with it, then I don't think there's a problem. The thing that helps, though, is if you're in a firm that understands and appreciates the value that librarians offer to the particular situation. I've heard, and I have never experienced this, but I have heard stories in certain firms where there is not that appreciation for librarians necessarily as a profession, and so they may perhaps treat their staff a little bit differently. But I have an answer for that too. You know, certainly I understand there's personality differences and cultures across myriad firms, but I also think then that, you know, even though it's harder for the librarian, it's that librarian's job to sort of educate the partner or the whatever. I mean, it's difficult, but it makes your job more difficult if you have to do that, but that's also what your job is, and so.
Having worked for Roberta,
yes,
I assume that she was a mentor for you during the
yes.
years you were there. Are there any lasting lessons you learned from that period of time working for her? I know you worked with her again later, but just from
yes.
law firm.
I think one of the early lessons that I learned from Roberta was that you don't just have one mentor, and that you have a mentor for different reasons, which is actually true. I mean, I cite to a lot of the names that I've mentioned. I think I would claim as good mentors, where I could call them up and ask them certain things. The Dean, Darcy. There are a lot of other people in the profession right now that I have called on occasion. I have long conversations with them about certain things, and I think that's one of the key things, is that it's all about you and how you develop yourself, and you need to look out for this information. Like a good librarian, you gather all the information that you can, and then you make your decision. So.
Now, when and why did you decide to leave Covington for CRS?
Okay, there's another little bit of serendipity here. So actually, I guess this is one other lesson that I did learn from Roberta, is that you're constantly looking out for yourself. So while I was at Covington, even though I was there for almost 8 years, I probably applied to 10 or 12 different jobs, other firms, academics, government agencies, just to explore what was out there. If I saw something that was interesting, I thought I might as well throw my hat in the ring. And was offered quite a few jobs. Well, at least I can think of 3 or 4. But I never left Covington because it was always that comparison. Well, this is what they're offering me now. Either Covington gave me something different to do, or it was just not quite the same, and I didn't make that change. But I did put myself out there. And one of them, obviously the last one, was I saw a posting for the Congressional Research Service, which everyone always hears about as the fabled research arm of Congress. It works at the Library of Congress. So I saw this posting, did not understand the posting at all, to be quite honest. I did not understand what the job was, but I thought, well, this sounds interesting. Maybe I should throw my hat in the ring, and I did. came for the interview, which for those who may not understand how the library does their interviews, it's a confidential panel that interviews you, and it's called a structured interview. So you have a very structured set of questions, and that every candidate has to be asked the same exact questions in the same order. It's very structured. And so I came, I had the interview, structured interview, and I thought, this is really bizarre. Honestly, I went home, I remember telling my wife that was very strange. I don't think I'd want to work there. But 2 days later, they called me back and said, can you come back and meet with some more folks? And it's actually, when I came back and I met with, started talking to people about what it is that they were trying to do, I thought, well, this is really, really interesting. Now, I should also step back and say, for the structured interview, it is very, very strange, but now having been on this side and being a part of a structured interview panel of, oh gosh, 30 or 40 times, I do see the value in it, and there really is a value in doing it this way, and it really, really does work. It's just that if you've never experienced it, it's an odd experience to actually be very, very structured like that. So anyway, that's how I ended up at CRS. I ultimately, again, it was serendipity. I saw the posting, I thought, oh, I'll send in the application, why not? It wasn't really that I, intended to have a career at the Library of Congress.
So after that second interview and you had a better idea of what the job was, did the job turn out to be what you had expected?
Yes. So CRS at that point in time was reinventing, not called librarians, they're called information professionals. And so the idea was to take all the information professionals that were originally embedded in all of the research divisions and put them all into one group as a business model. Hierarchically they're in one group, but then re-embed them into the policy, or many of them into the policy divisions to service whether it be social scientists or economists, or in my case, the attorneys. Well, actually I was brought in as the supervisor for the attorney groups. And I thought that was an excellent model, and of a way to sort of reinvent information professionals, if you will. It was a little bit different because it was not just law librarianship. It was librarians that dealt with environmental stuff, economics, government. So it wasn't just law librarians. And so we were part of a bigger group.
5 years later, you accept a position as the first ever Deputy Law Librarian of Congress. And we're reunited with Roberta,
yes,
who was then Law Librarian of Congress. As you were the very first to hold this position, were there unique challenges for you to defining your position's responsibilities?
Yes, again, you were right, it was a new position, and so coming in, it was to try to figure out what needed to be done to help Roberta accomplish her mission and her goals and her vision for the Library of Congress. And a couple of the things that I did, well, most importantly, what I worked with is the foreign law specialist here and in the international part of the law library, and working with a couple of programs there, one the foreign law specialist, and then also at the time the Global Legal Information Network.
And did you know that Roberta would be your supervisor at the time that you applied?
Supervisor where?
Sorry, at the Law Library of Congress.
Oh yes,
so
no, definitely, yes, I knew Roberta was already the law librarian.
By then?
Yes,
all right. I just wasn't sure
correct.
because sometimes the process is longer and sometimes it's shorter, so I wasn't sure how long the process was.
Yes.
What would you name your major accomplishments as deputy?
So one of the first projects that was handed to me was to work on the Global Legal Information Network and try to figure out what we're going to do with it. I mean, certainly we still don't have an answer. It's a little bit in hiatus right now, but I think we crafted together a good solution. It's now that we just need to finish executing on that solution. That was one of the biggest things that I worked on during that year and a half, I think it was. So.
In 2012, you were appointed Law Librarian of Congress. In an interview for the library's blog, you had stated that you felt your position was part Law Librarian to Congress, part steward for law collections, and part ambassador to the world's legal and library communities.
Yes.
After 2 years in the position, has your view of the job changed?
No, it's still very important. Those are, I think, the very first three aspects of the job that are still what it is that I do. I mean, certainly the Law Librarian of Congress, I am the Law Librarian for Congress. So being the Law Librarian for Congress is never going to change. It's part of our statute, actually. Our statutory mandate that created the Law Library of Congress. In terms of the stewards of the collection, yes, because we as an institution are still collecting materials, and we will continue to do so. we have a mission to not only acquire but preserve it for future generations. So unlike maybe, and no disrespect to your institution, but certain institutions that are trying to cut back on perhaps some of the things that they're acquiring, we won't do that, at least not in the near term, because we have this mission that we know we have to preserve it for future generations, the American people, not the world. And so we still are acquiring and preserving, and so that's my steward mission. And it's certainly outreach. I think it's very, very important. I constantly am reaching out to not just our constituents like Congress, constituents I mean as in our clients, Congress and the other parts of government, but to new folks as well, not just academic law libraries or lawyers, but we're looking out for anybody that might have need an occasion to refer to our legal collections, because that's what it's here for.
Going back to collections, how has the environment for legal information, licensing and other things, impacted how the law librarian looks at what is your collection?
That's a good question. A little bit of, I mean, certainly it does impact what it is that we're doing, but to a certain extent it doesn't, in the sense that we're still collecting in print. Now, if you're talking about digital-only materials, that's slightly different. But if it comes in both print and electronic, for the most part, if we can, we're still getting it in print, because we still have that mission, and because there's still, of course, no standard, and we don't understand if the electronic is going to be available, we're trying to make sure that we can be able to present this information in 100 years. In terms of digital-only, that's a little more complicated, and certainly that is a big challenge for us. Now, luckily for us, we have the U.S. Copyright Office that's part of the Library of Congress, and so in terms of acquiring our, through copyright deposit, we are able to acquire a lot of materials at substantial savings.
In your ambassador role, you mentioned reaching out to communities who might need to use the law library's resources. With your limited resources, how do you prioritize between what organizations to reach out to, what countries to reach out to, or what projects to undertake?
Well, of course, number one, our client is Congress. And then we, of course, have a responsibility to support the federal judiciary. The Supreme Court relies upon us heavily in the executive branch. After that, we are, we try to reach out to everybody. Now, increasingly, we're able to do this through technology. So rather than, as an ambassador, I travel around and talk to these people, but we make a lot of our content available through our website. We are targeting people through social media, things like that, so that we can take advantage of the technology and the automation, if you will, that will allow us to do all of this at a fraction of the cost and time. But I'm sorry, Yvette, can I just mention one serendipity thing?
Yes.
Because, to close out my serendipity, I started my career with serendipity, and now I shouldn't say I'm closing out, because I hope I'm not closing out my career. But my one final story, and I do need to mention this, and again, it is serendipity about when I'm sometimes asked, well, how did you become the Law Librarian of Congress? And so I have to tell folks the story that back in, let's see, I'm trying to think what Congress it was. I was still working at CRS at the time, and CRS does has what's called the new member seminar. At the beginning of every Congress, they invite the new members that are newly elected, and they bring them to Williamsburg and have a 3-day session on legislative process, the issues of the day, to help train them to become good legislators. And I think it was my first new member seminar. I went twice, and Dr. Billington was there. I had never met him before. And at one point in time, I had provided some service to Dr. Billington, and it was very helpful to him. And so he wanted to get to know me better at being an employee of his in the Library of Congress. So he sat me down, actually very similar to this. We were in a hotel lobby. He pulled 2 chairs together, just like we're sitting right now, and he put on his best professorial, inquisitive look and started talking to me about, well, tell me about yourself. What is it that you want to do, and things like that. And I mean, maybe I was a little glib about it, but I at one point said to Dr. Billington, when he asked me the question of, well, what do you want to do with your life, basically was the question, I said, well, Dr. Billington, I'm a law librarian by training. I would love to be the Law Librarian of Congress someday.
Great answer.
And so for about 4.5 years later, maybe the moral of the story is you have to be careful what you ask for. But it is a true story. And that's why I like to use that as a bit of a serendipity. But to be serious about that, I think it really is very, very important, because one of the things that I try to tell younger librarians, or not even librarians, but just anybody who's interested in, if they want to know about my background and how to get ahead, so to speak, I said, my point is that you do really have to get yourself out there, stick your neck out there. As I mentioned before, when I was at Covington, I applied for many different jobs, and it was just because I was interested and constantly looking to see what was out there. Not that I actually took any of them until I came to CRS, but I wanted to keep my options open. And so that's one of the very important things that I try to encourage people to do, is just keep your option open. It's you yourself that are responsible for your career and your development. You know, certainly there may be mentors that are looking out for you and guides and things like that, but it's ultimately up to you yourself to go where you will.
Right.
So, sorry for that.
No, that's great. And I'm actually now going to borrow one of Dr. Billington's questions and say, so as Law Librarian of Congress, what are your...
The Law Librarian of Congress or the Librarian?
Oh, sorry. Right. What are your goals in this position for the short term?
Well, some of the questions that we're trying to get our handles on right now, it really is the digital question. We are seeing increasingly scarce resources. I mentioned that we get copyright deposit, but certainly the rest of the world, that doesn't cover the rest of the world, and we still need to acquire materials from the rest of the world. So I think one of the things I'd like to work on is how we can, two things, I guess. One is, perhaps acquire materials in a more cost-effective way, perhaps digitally, and digitally seems like it's the right answer. But the second part of that is making that stuff available too, and working on how we can get not just our collection, but just collections, whether it's law or other things in the library, available to the bigger part of the world. That's the ambassador part of what we do here at the library. So I think that's in the near term really what I would like to concentrate on. I don't know how successful we'll be. It's very, very difficult, as you well know.
Very difficult,
yes.
But a great challenge to be facing in terms of options for us.
Sure.
You were the first Asian to serve in this position. Does that carry any special meaning for you?
Sure. I mean, certainly I'm proud of the fact that, as I guess am I considered first generation? I guess it depends on who you talk to. My parents weren't educated here. My grandfather did study in the United States before he went back to China, so I don't know how that all works out. But I think it's nice that I can, say I've accomplished something on, behalf of Asians, right? Is that right? But certainly you, Michelle, as the director and professor of law at Georgetown University, I guess the question would be to you. Do you feel the same way, right? How many women Asian directors are there? How many male Asian directors are there? Not that very many.
You're absolutely right.
Whether they be in firms or academics or government and agencies. So certainly I think it's nice, yes. But of course all right, I'll just leave it at that.
You have a tremendous record of commitment to professional service. You have served as member or chair of over 15 AALL committees or task forces, and as treasurer/executive board member for both LSDC and AALL. You're also one of the founding members of the Chinese and American Forum on Legal Information in Law Libraries. Could you describe some of the professional activities that have meant the most to you? Well, certainly
AALL has been a terrific place for me to develop professionally in the law library profession, and if you'll permit me a little bit to continue on my serendipity, yes, I have served on a lot of committees, but some of that was a little bit of serendipity as well. But I think it does have a bit bigger lesson, and I'll start by saying it was serendipity that got me started. So one of the first committees I served on was copyright, which, as we all know, is a very important committee. I had an interest in it, but it's also very difficult to serve on copyright committee, especially as a newer member of the profession. And here's where the serendipity came in. I was, I think, already at Covington at the time. I was at a reception, and Bob Oakley was there. And he was either incoming president, it's the incoming president that does the committee assignment. So he was going to be president of AALL. And we were having a discussion, and he was trying to engage me as a newer librarian to learn about what it is I was interested in, things like that, as he was very good at doing and developing the younger folks in the profession and the association. And so I got to talking to him, and I said, I'm very interested in copyright. I took classes, and a lot of people do that, I'm sure. But he followed up, and he actually put me on the copyright committee, which is where I got my start. And then through some other activities in the association, I actually got to meet some of the really fabulous people, leaders of the community. Cassette Sun, I'm thinking of, Carol Avery Nicholson, Frank Liu, all lines in the profession, if you will. And through making their acquaintances, then I got Carol put me on the Centennial Celebration Committee, which had Carol Billings, Jim Heller, Frank Hodek, Jacobs, who else was on the, I'm trying to think. Anyway, all of these past presidents was I can't remember now, but if you look at it, you can surely look it up who else was on the committee. But anyway, I got to know all of these people, and again, it's a little bit of serendipity how I got there, but it's those connections that you make that then help you develop in your career. And that's another thing that I always tell students or younger folks is that be a member of your professional association, whether it be AALL, SLA if you want, ALA, or if you're not in librarianship, whatever accounting or law profession, whatever professional position, professional organization is available for your profession. Because I think it's very, very important. It really will help you develop your career by helping you make connections, by getting to know how the profession works and how that group can have an influence on developing the profession. Again, it's what you put into it, how you will get out of it. Is that right?
Yes, what you get out of it is what
we
you
put
into
it.
it.
Right, exactly. And so it's very, very important to volunteer and do these things. I pretty much try to go every year to Connell, at least volunteer at the marketplace and talk to new folks when they're coming in, to try to stress how important it is to, at least in the AAL context, to volunteer for a committee, or even if you don't get selected for a committee, because sometimes there are too many volunteers. And don't be discouraged, just keep putting your name out there, volunteering, whether it be with a local chapter or whatever. Eventually you'll get that experience, and that's how you'll develop, I think.
Absolutely. So we're nearing the end of our conversation.
Okay.
Before closing, however, is there anything you'd like to add that we haven't covered already?
I think you've covered pretty good ground. I mean, I think I've made the points that I was, in the back of my mind, I was thinking of when you first contacted me about making an doing an interview, which is stressing the fact that individuals are responsible for their own careers, and you have to go out there and you sort of get what you want, or at least make the connections or figure out how certain things will help you. The second thing was to volunteer and be a part of, an active participant in a professional organization or a committee. And then what was the third thing I wanted? There's some third thing that I wanted to say, but I got it out at any rate. So if you watch the entire interview, it'll get to you by osmosis, right? Anyway.
Fantastic. On that note, let me thank you, David, on my behalf and that of our colleagues with whom I'm working on this history, Pat Kehoe, Frank Hudek, and Dick Spinelli, for participating in today's conversation. Your insights, the information you have shared, and the stories you have told will make a valuable contribution to the Oral History of Law Librarianship series on Spinelli's Law Library Reference Shelf on Hein Online. Thank you.